people think nuclear...
The renewable sector generate the
question, Hinkley Point.
The North Sea in this country.
Aren't going to give us that base provision that gives us the industrial underpinning that we require.
Well, perhaps I can ask one then to kick us off. We're in Aberdeen, we're in the northeast, a town that's suffering greatly from the collapse in oil prices. I didn't really hear anyone mention at all what future they saw for the North Sea in this country's energy plans. Would anyone like to perhaps explain if there is a future still for the North Sea?
Well,
Mark?
I think I kind of did touch on that, but yes, there is. You know, we have been here before in the northeast in terms of a low oil price, and the oil price has been lower than it currently is. The issue at the moment is that when the oil price was lower in the past, the cost of production was also lower. And as the fields have matured, cost of production, cost of extraction has obviously gone up. And that's the challenge that is currently being faced. And one of the things that companies are trying to do is to reduce that overall cost by cutting costs in other areas. So there is a future there. And prices is likely to pick up again, probably towards the end of the year, analysts are suggesting. But
how high?
We'll see. I'm not going to stick my neck out and make a prediction on that.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to make one point, Mark, if I may. Your party talked a lot about North Sea oil revenues in the run-up to the independence referendum. It's hardly mentioned now by your party. The oil price, if it goes up at the end of this year, no one is predicting we'll get to a break-even point in the North Sea just yet. No one's talking beyond $50 a barrel. So within that, I mean, it's fine to talk about production costs are getting lower in the North Sea. They certainly are. It's still the most expensively produced oil in the world. So what is the future for the North Sea against that backdrop?
Indeed, and that's why, I mean, so if you look at, and we've looked at the example of sort of Norway in the mid-2000s when there was a price dip, and Norway put incentives in place for exploration and basically incentivized companies to go out and undertake exploration activity. Now that has the benefit of keeping activity going in some areas and keeping jobs open. It also has benefits to the supply chain, and the supply chain is really important in the Northeast. There's a lot of small to medium-sized companies who don't have a lot of fat to trim when it comes to costs. So there are companies out there who are going to struggle unless we can stimulate some form of activity in the North Sea. So incentivising exploration would assist in that, and also means that when we do get to a point that the price goes to either break even or above, you're in a much better position to take advantage of the discoveries that you will have made, which Norway did in the mid-2000s. They found a huge discovery, and the price picked up. They were able to exploit that to their advantage. So, you know, I think exploration is the key in the short to medium term as we look for the price to pick up.
Just before I go to Neil, just as a show of hands, does anyone think the Norwegian model should be applied to the North Sea? The exploration breaks that companies get, tax breaks. Show of hands, if that's possible? Oh, about a third, okay, or a quarter. Okay, Neil.
So I think the first point I would want to make is, I've talked about as being a transition, but there's still clearly a demand for oil and gas. So I guess the future of Aberdeen comes down to economics. And those economics have two aspects. One, what are the market dynamics that define the price of oil, and what is that, and what can the cost of production is clearly something that people have some control over, and there's clearly a big focus on driving down the cost of production. One thing I should have mentioned in my remarks, of course, was also the growth of offshore wind, and we expect by the end of this decade there to be, between now and the end of the decade, for there to be 2 significant sized offshore wind farms being built off the east coast of Scotland, one in the Moray Firth and one off further east in the Firth of Forth. And the UK government has said it is very committed and very supportive of offshore wind, so we'd expect further schemes to be successful in bidding for contracts in the future. So it's not going to be on the scale that people thought it could be 3, 4, 5 years ago, but there will be significant activity in offshore wind in Scotland, other parts of the UK and other parts of Europe, and there will be opportunities for the oil and gas supply chain in those developments.
Thank you. Tom Pickering, fracking doesn't seem to be doing any favours to the North Sea.
That's unfair. I was about to make a positive comment about the North Sea, having just bought assets in the southern North Sea with the help of Brodies. I think, look, actually the comments I was going to make on the North Sea, I think we're at a very different stage in the North Sea's life. I think when you plot the price against the remaining resource and reserves that is in the ground, it's a very different backdrop that you're making economic assessment against, pushing up against a decommissioning. So I think over this next period, the focus on cost in the North Sea and in deconstructing that cost, changing the supply chain relationships, sort of building up again. I wonder if the easiest way to paint that picture is to think back to the early days of the North Sea, when you had a lot of the small companies providing services to a developing offshore industry. And you take, I don't know, the Wood Group as a family business that was here all those years ago, grasped that opportunity and grew in the way that it did. I wonder if a deconstruction to some smaller companies able to do that cost represents, I think, a vibrant opportunity. I think shale provides a really decent opportunity for some of the skill set in the North Sea. I think particularly for me, the reservoir engineering skill that exists up here, we as a competence, understanding reservoir, understanding how the reservoir dynamic is moving, is something that is really a cornerstone jewel in Aberdeen's crown, if you like. And the shale story, actually still understanding how that reservoir works in the different areas, be it gas or oil plays in the US, they're still making strides in understanding that, and I think we have an opportunity to apply the type of knowledge. I think, you know, in losing good labour up here, the opportunity, if we could, to take some of that skilled labour force, deploy it into shale projects and development, I think would be beneficial. But I think also, just finally up here, there's a real, when we talk about the internationalising a skill set from Aberdeen, we run the risk of losing good people at the moment to other industries, and the ability to scale and deploy those people when the price will rise eventually. I think we'll be wondering what we've lost in our ability to export, and we'll also be looking at what dent, irrecoverable dent, has occurred in the North Sea. That will be the looking back in 3 years' time, say.
Thank you. Hey, gentleman there, just around the middle. Thank you.
James Green from the Chamber of Commerce. I think I've heard some consensus about transition to a low carbon economy from all of you, actually, and gas playing part of that. I was asked to give evidence down at the fracking inquiry, UK government inquiry in Blackpool, and it struck me from, let's just say, the friendly banter that I got from some of the locals while I was there, that actually this is maybe not a scientific and economic argument. If you can get that right, that's one part of it. But actually, there's a big hearts and minds piece that, dare I say, the onshore industry hasn't got right so far. So how do you overcome that? Because the science will be part of it, but there's the people argument to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, the first piece for us, there's a number of elements to that. I think the first piece is, you know, not hiding, getting out there and talking to people. We've done over 70 events just in the Central Belt of Scotland. You know, 200 people. A number of those events, people very unhappy that they haven't been spoken to, very unhappy that companies haven't made themselves available to answer questions. You know, haven't talked about the risks and the issues that you're dealing with. Okay, people understand it's an industry and you're managing these things, and they want to understand the regulations, how you're doing it. Then I think it also comes to a key piece of this has been for us actually stepping right back from shale and from fracking and just talking about the use of gas. Because in any of that journey, you know, you're describing to people that not only are you using it as a heat source and, you know, for cooking in homes, you know, all of that side of an energy and fuel, but it is also a feedstock and a basic building block, you know, an essential ingredient of the things we make. So, and the third element, I guess, that you raise is the environmental element. And, you know, if I point to Friends of the Earth's own contribution to the Department of Energy and Climate Change pathways calculator to transitioning, they point to natural gas being that contributor to the fossil fuel that is able to give you both. It allows you to transition to 2050 and gives you the fuel and the feedstock element, in a fuel sense and in CO2 terms. I think the other piece then that you're wrestling with as you try to set this out for people, which is all that you're doing as you describe it, is the time and material science element to it. So some of the things we point to as technologies, yes, they're advancing and they're advancing quickly, but some of them they're still sitting within a decade to 2-decade window, and they're wholly reliant on petrochemicals as the basis of their construction, even right now, the basis of their construction, so the plastics and chemicals needed. So you're trying to map out for people just a very centered picture of exactly the energy use and material science. Then you get to saying, well, actually, if we are willing to import that shale gas to Scotland to underpin our industry, so we are making a choice to bring that in, an economic choice, an environmental choice, and we're also making a choice about the standard to which somebody else conducts themselves in developing and bringing that gas to market. So, and there's the security argument. So you start to build this picture, and we've found it just very, very helpful in deconstructing it to the point that we say, well, okay, if we're accepting then that natural gas is a useful fuel and important to us, are we going to grasp it and seek to develop it and get the security, build the competence of developing it and contextualizing it, not in North Dakota, but here, more akin to Pennsylvania in development, but absolutely, within our regulatory environment. So you start way back in that chain and you build up the conversation, and actually when you do that and you patiently do it and you listen to the concerns that people have, because then they get to the final part of it is, okay, talk to me the risks and issues that you're dealing with. And there are really 3 elements to that. There's a supply chain element, there's an operational element on the site, and then there's a wellbore construction and management element. And you're able to then put those risks and issues into each of the buckets, relate our activities and management of the activity and the regulations that exist with government into those. And it's that path, I think, it's a long path. And all I would say is what I've tried to put out is that we would be better seeing the proof in the pudding, advancing physical activity alongside that conversation as well.
Thanks, Tom. Neil, it's just hearts and minds that's stopping fracking.
I guess I'd make a few comments. The first one is around, I don't think, as I said in my remarks, this is not an either-or debate, and I think people are very quick to see through those kind of pitches, either-or. If you go back a few years, for example, the debate was all around, do we want nuclear or renewables, for example. At the moment, there's a little bit of an element of the debate which is around, do we need new gas or do we need renewables? I think we need to avoid those either-or debates, but look at what the system and the country as a whole needs. I think in terms of the future for fracking, the benchmark has been set, again, I would say in SNP's manifesto, where they say fracking will only go ahead or can only go ahead if it can be demonstrated that there's no concerns around environmental and public health. So I guess that has to be the focus of Tom and his colleagues' communication. I think our experience as an industry, again, if you go back 4 or 5 years, you couldn't open a newspaper without seeing some kind of horror story or scare story about an onshore wind development or about the sector, that cows weren't producing as much milk as they used to because of wind farms, that the Earth's axis was being twisted because of the drag of all these terrible wind farms. And I think once things are developed, once they're built, once people see the reality rather than the scare stories, they form their own judgments and they form sensible and rational judgments on them. So Tom said at the end there, you've got to keep going. And I think we see a very different and a more rational debate about renewables now than we did 4 or 5 years ago, when it was all about scare stories about onshore wind. And just one last comment. To some extent, I don't think this is about the energy sector. I just think any kind of development is difficult and can arouse hostility in neighbouring people that live in and around developments. So neither fracking nor renewables, but the most unpopular plan decision ever in Scotland was for a coal-fired power station in Hunterston, which was going to be CCS ready and all the rest of it, 25,000 letters against that scheme. The Bewley-Denny scheme, 21,500 letters against, but again, now it's built, the negativity around it has just dissipated. So I don't think this is about fracking or onshore wind or anything else. I just think development is difficult.
Mark, with that in mind, then, is it perhaps time to lift the moratorium, see what happens with fracking, as we've seen with wind farms? And
no, I think it's time to make sure that we get the evidence in place that allows us to make a firm decision on fracking, and that's what the moratorium was designed to do, was to allow for that evidence gathering. And that will be followed by a consultation during which we will see what people's concerns are and how those stack against what the moratorium has discovered. And what, it's not my position to advocate for Tom's position on this. He's capable of doing that himself. But I think that I hear what Neil is saying, and I think that he's quite right that in the past the renewable sector used to get quite the kicking, it still does in some areas, it would be fair to say, but a lot of what was said at the time has been what was disproved at the time anyway. The science that sat behind it was solid. The situation in relation to fracking is that there is a great deal that we do not yet have enough evidence on. We've seen, some would call it scare stories, some would say experiences from other areas which have seen fracking, which gives suggestion that there are community impacts that might want to be avoided, and we'll see during the course of the moratorium and the evidence gathering whether those are with foundation and whether they would be ones that would take effect in Scotland, because it's worth remembering that the areas that Tom is talking about in Scotland are the areas where we have significant population density in terms of the areas that Tom and his colleagues want to undertake fracking. So, there is a real onus on us to make sure, absolutely, that we pin down what the impact on public health, on the environment and on communities would be as a consequence of this. Because if we get that wrong, in terms of, if Tom and his colleagues were to get their opportunity and it was to turn out that there was that impact, then that would have some very serious consequences, not just for the politicians who've taken that decision, but for those communities who are going to have to live with the effects of that decision.
Any other questions from the floor? Well, perhaps if I can just picking up on what you said there, Mark, why did the government's panel of experts then decide that fracking was safe?
Well, no, they said it could be safe.
Could be safe, yeah.
Could be safe. But
they could have said it couldn't be safe.
Well, perhaps that would be a better question to pose to the panel of experts than to pose to me as to why they.
Well, you're government commission, that's why I'm asking.
But there is also a body of evidence out there that takes the alternative view, and so when you have that, we've decided that a longer period of evidence gathering, looking at all of the different arguments, looking at all of the different pieces of evidence that exist where fracking is currently taking place, and how that relates to the Scottish perspective is the right way to go.
Good point. Anyone else like to follow up on that? Gentleman there on the right. The microphone is whisking its way to you as we speak.
Calvin is Seeking Galbraith Surveyors. A question, Hinkley Point, this sort of nuclear question, Neil mentioned about nuclear being part of the equation, and I'm not quite sure, the whole decision about Hinkley Point seems to be drifting, and there seems to be a growing body saying it's never going to happen, which might be a fundamental gap emerging. And I wondered how, does the panel feel that nuclear at that scale is a reality and will happen, and if it doesn't happen, is there enough space to fill the gap? Thank you.
I think we'll have Neil on that one, please.
So, again, a bit like Mark, I don't know the inner machinations of EDF's decision-making process and investment decision process. I think what is clear is that the UK government remains very committed to nuclear. All the discussion has focused on EDF and Hinkley Point, but as we know, there are 1, 2, 3 other parties who are potentially interested in building new nuclear plants in the UK. And time will tell if we can, excuse me, if the UK government is able to develop an investment framework that works for those parties to take forward plants in the UK. One thing I would say, though I think it's clear, so some of the arguments are nuclear around cost, for example, and it's clear that mature renewables such as onshore wind and solar are already 10 to 15% cheaper than new nuclear plants based on the contracts that were awarded by the UK government last year. Renewables are going to become considerably less expensive, and I think one of the tragedies of the pause of the investment that we've seen in renewables and mature renewables has been with another 1 or 2 rounds of contract allocation. I think you would have started to see some really significant daylight between the costs of renewables and the cost of nuclear, and that may lead or have led ministers to make different decisions around the merits of those different technologies. So I do think the UK government remain committed to new nuclear power. I would say I see some signs that commitment is starting to be questioned a little bit because of cost and because of understanding the cost of renewables. What's going to fill the gap if we don't have Hinkley Point? There are gigawatts of renewables projects ready to go if we put an investment framework in place that allows them to go ahead. And we're talking 10, 15 years from now, so there are plenty of ways for the UK to create a market framework that would bring forward other forms of electricity generation, low carbon electricity generation, between now and the date that most people expect Hinkley Point would start to generate.
Mark, the Scottish Government is obviously opposed to nuclear power. How do you feel the shortfall then?
Well, I think Neil makes a very important point there that, you're not talking about a tomorrow, that this needs to be addressed. You've got a lead in time, and I think the difficulty I have is that the decision making that the UK government has done is to say we're not going to offer that initial startup subsidy in terms of wind and solar, but we're going to put a significant subsidy into Hinkley Point. And there's often talk about one of the arguments that is often used by those who are opponents of renewable energy is the subsidy that is required for renewable energy projects. But as Neil's talking about, we're getting to the stage now in terms of development of renewables that's going to become less and less of an issue. But there's a massive subsidy being allocated in relation to Hinkley Point, eye-watering sums. I think the issue around Hinkley Point is probably going to be linked to how the Chinese economy performs, given that China now has quite a significant stake in relation to Hinkley Point, and that's going to determine the timescale as much as anything else. So I think that there are opportunities there. I think that the other issue that needs to be addressed and would help, I think, in terms of bringing more renewable projects, low carbon projects on stream is around the transmission charging and the cost of connecting to the grid, particularly for those locations which have got some of the potential highest renewable yield, but also would face some of the most prohibitive transmission charging costs. Because if you develop a plant in the southeast of England, you'll get a subsidy to connect to the grid. But if you develop it in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, you will face a significant cost. And investors at the moment, when they're looking at the possible return on investment, are going to be weighing that up. So dealing with that transmission charging issue, I think, is a very important means to try and address some of those issues.
Just a show of hands, please, if we can. How many people think nuclear industry should be subsidised in this country? Nobody. Very few people. Renewables? Slightly more. What about the oil sector? Other than lawyers, any oil workers here? Sorry, Neil, you just wanted to come back on something there before?
Just to clarify what's in it. So I wasn't necessarily suggesting that we are pro or anti-nuclear. It was more around the false presentation of binary decisions in the energy debate. So, as I said in my remarks, the Committee on Climate Change, who are the experts in terms of what the UK needs to do in terms of working within international treaties on climate change, what that means in terms of actually a concrete energy mix. They say whether you go for an ambitious nuclear programme or not, whether you have CCS or not, in all their models, you need to at least double the UK's capacity of renewable power from 2015 to 2030. And that was the point I was trying to make. Yeah.
Obviously, we have nuclear energy being generated in Scotland, and we're committed to seeing those plants out to the end of their lives. But if you look at countries like Germany and Switzerland, for example, which have taken a policy decision that they're going to phase out nuclear, so it is possible to have an energy policy that does not depend on continuation of nuclear power, and I think that's something that the UK government should have spent more time looking at than perhaps investing the sums of money that it's likely to have to invest in terms of Hinkley Point.
Tom Pickering, nuclear energy, a lot of investment in that. That's bad for your company, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. From our point of view, you're much wiser minds than us of decades ago described variety, and I think we will see, hopefully, as Neil said, you get this much more intelligent debate about weighing up energy sources, getting the balance of economics across it, getting the sustained base load that's needed for industry, and getting the environmental credentials that you need through it on balance. So for us as a business, we talk about renewables, but big customer, and hopefully will continue to be so and grow, and base load equally remains extremely important to us.
Mm-hmm. Just again, yeah. Sorry, question there from Claire.
Thanks. Claire Monroe from Brodies. I just have a question for Mark. So, if the Scottish government is not supportive of nuclear, the offshore industry is declining, and you've got a moratorium on shale, where do you? And we obviously need to be investing now for the future. What do you see the energy mix as being in 2050 in Scotland?
2050, goodness.
Well, that's the kind of timescale you need to look forward to be investing now to get the infrastructure in place for then.
Well, first of all, we're looking at, we've said that in the next Parliament we're going to consult on and produce a new energy strategy. We're very clear that Scotland has a significant role to play in terms of renewable energy. We've got a lot of potential here to generate from renewables, and this idea that renewables are unreliable that Tom was putting forward earlier, that doesn't bear out in terms of what you see in terms of generation potential. Oil and gas will play a role in terms of that, and there are opportunities still, I think, going forward from that. The nuclear plants that are here will extend to the end of their lives in terms of generation from those. But I think there are going to be other opportunities out there that are going to arise in the next 20, 30 years. I don't know what those are going to be, but we're confident that we've got the potential here in Scotland to have a good energy mix and to be able to sustain Scotland's energy needs from what we have in Scotland.
Forgive me, Mark, the question was, what will the energy mix look like in 2050?
What will it look like in 2050? Well, I think it will be probably significantly more in terms of renewable than in other forms. I think will be the likelihood by 2050. I think we will have a significantly higher level of renewable energy generation and energy from renewables. We're looking at looking seriously at the suggestion from Neil around 50% energy being met from renewables. I think there is undoubtedly potential for that. Neil said Sweden have been able to achieve that, so I don't see what would preclude us from doing so. So there are opportunities there for us to do that and then potentially go beyond that if it's something that is doable.
Tom Pickering.
I think that given a consultation, the facts will out, and I hope that my generation will see some portion of shale gas in Scotland contributing to the energy mix safely and sensibly, and I also hope that the North Sea continues to provide over the next couple of decades as well. And I do think that we'll see increased renewables. I do think there are technologies out there that will advance and more rapidly advance, but I'm not sure I'd wish to, at this stage, stake my hand entirely on that. If on the basis I could hedge, I would hedge on the things of certainty, the technologies I understand and know, and the outcomes I think I could affect. And I think in front of us, we know that the storage capabilities coming on, but will it come on at the pace that we need it to? So I think by 2050 you'll see definitely improved storage. But I look to the base industries. You pick the figure I gave for Grangemouth in terms of base load. If we're still reliant on the materials science of output and fuels from that, then actually, you know, we are going to need significant baseload energy provision, albeit we might take capacity off on a residential basis.
Neil?
So again, the transition to me looks like us moving to a much more flexible and dynamic energy system. Baseload starting to look like something from the 1950s rather than the 2050s, and actually a flexible, dynamic system with cheap, cost-effective, plentiful renewables at its core, with a much bigger degree of storage, a much bigger degree of management of the way we use energy, much greater steps to minimise the way we use energy, and both interconnection at a European scale, but also a big growth in very, very local energy generation and demand and growth in the kinds of things we've seen in the last few years of the explosion of people putting solar panels on their roofs. But I think overall, Scotland continues to be an economy and a country which is in many ways defined by its energy industry, the energy industry at the heart of its economy, and that Scotland, if it chooses to do so, can absolutely continue to be an exporter of energy to the rest of the UK and further afield.
I guess, sorry, just to come back, I guess the community element of that is something that obviously I focused on in the earlier part of my remarks, and we want to encourage more community-based energy, community-generated energy. Now, whether that's communities generating energy for that community or generating energy that they put back into the grid and get a financial benefit for that community from, you know, that will be for local communities to determine how they want to do that and what the feasibility of that is. But another area where I think we are behind the curve in Scotland, and Scandinavia is an area which is well ahead of this, is in terms of the use of waste to create energy. And I've visited energy from waste plants in Scandinavia. I visited one in Malmo. You know, those are issues which create controversy locally. There's no doubt about that in terms of applications for that. But the Scandinavians have overcome that, and indeed, if you speak to environmentalists in Scandinavia, they're actually very positive about energy from waste. So that's an area where perhaps we need to do a bit more here, because that, again, from a local community perspective, you have the energy that goes into the grid, but you also have the potential for the heat from that to be used for a community benefit as well. So there are potential wins there, and that would again reduce some of that energy demand if you can create that heat demand at a local level. That reduces some of that energy demand and also reduces energy costs for the consumer, which is a benefit as well.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I'm afraid our hour is up, unless anyone's got a burning question they want to ask. Well, they've got at least one politician in front of them. No? OK. Well, I think we can all agree on one thing. All our panellists have given us a very lively and thought-provoking hour, so I'm sure you'll join me in thanking them with a round of applause. People think nuclear...
The renewable sector generate the
question, Hinkley Point.
The North Sea in this country
aren't going to give us that base provision that gives us the industrial underpinning that we require.